I'm Ben Wattenberg. In recent years, newspapers have prided themselves on the Joe Friday school of journalism, just the facts, ma'am. But something new is now said to be on the scene. It goes by different names like public journalism, civic participation, community journalism, conclusive journalism. No matter what you call it, this journalism sets out to go beyond just the facts and tries to shape the agenda. Questions: is this new? Is this a liberal trick? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Jane Eisner, editorial page editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which recently won the gold medal from the National Association of Opinion Page Editors. Steve Cuozzo, executive editor of the New York Post and author of It's Alive, How America's Oldest Newspaper Cheated Death and Why It Matters. James Fishkin, chairman of the Department of Government at the University of Texas and author of The Voice of the People. And Jodie Allen, Washington editor of the online magazine Slate and former editor of the Outlook section at the Washington Post. The topic before this House is public journalism. Journalism. The Philadelphia Inquirer's new editorial policies reflect the goals of public journalism. In a controversial series, two Inquirer reporters critiqued U.S. economic policy. The title of the series explains its thrust: America, Who Stole the Dream? The authors expressed strong and strongly disputed opinions in the news section on page 1. They proposed, among other things, higher tariffs, immigration restrictions, and raising taxes on the wealthy. Other aspects of public journalism include a heavier reliance on public participation through focus groups, reader polls, reader editorials, newspaper-sponsored civic groups, and candidate forums. It all sounds good, but critics say voters end up spoon-fed with the views of the establishment media. For example, in North Carolina, led by the Charlotte Observer, the major media used polls and focus groups in an attempt to shape the agenda and then drive the coverage of the Senate campaign. Senator Jesse Helms refused to play along, saying he should be allowed to run on his record, for good or for ill. Jane Eisner, public journalism is a terribly amorphous phrase. What are we talking about?
Well, it is very amorphous, and I think that's one of the problems with it. So I can only answer what it means to me as an editorial page editor. It's really very simple. I think it just means, from my point of view, involving readers much more on the pages of my editorial pages, whether that's in editorials, op-ed pieces, or letters. And to do that, I think you really have to reach out to folks who would not ordinarily write to us. Not everybody has a press agent or a fax machine and can send perfectly structured 800-word op-ed pieces to major newspapers. And it's to those people, whether they're younger or disenfranchised or just don't believe that we're interested in what they think, those are the folks that we are reaching out to.
Professor James Fishkin, what is it all about?
Public journalism? Well, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a journalist, but I've gotten involved in a lot of projects that people term public journalism. So I guess I'm an advocate of it, and I discuss it in my book. Public journalism, I think, means journalistic institutions take some responsibility for creating a public. By a public, I mean citizens who can talk to each other about the issues, are informed about the issues, and then whose voice is facilitated in some way. So it also means airing the people's agenda on the issues, not just horse race coverage of the campaign, but the issues that people really want to hear about, not just tabloid journalism, who's sleeping with whom or whatever, but issues that actually affect people's lives as ordinary people construe that. Now, it's very tricky to pull off, and my interest in something called deliberative polling, which represents what the public would think about the issues if it became engaged.
Which you did on PBS earlier this year.
Yes, yes. I've now been involved in eight deliberative polls, some national on PBS for the presidential candidates, some in other countries.
We'll come back to that in just a minute. Jodie Allen, what do you think of this stuff?
Well, I think it's being oversold. I think that what's good in it isn't new, and what's new in it isn't necessarily good. Obviously, it's good for a newspaper to be in touch with the people that it's serving, to go out and do good reporting on what's really concerning them, both locally but also nationally. And that's a danger when we simply get too much hand-holding of "don't you feel bad today." And I worry, so that I don't think that is new. If you're a good newspaper, you're out there reaching into your community, seeing what's going on, following it. But what worries me is that you do see this move in the news pages, not on the editorial pages, but in the case of the Philadelphia Inquirer, right on the news pages where crusades are being run, pretending to be news, obviously with strong and selective choices of the facts, or in some cases completely poll-driven, and cutting the politicians out of the political process and instead turning the control over to the pollsters.
Steve, he mentioned the magic word tabloid, and he did not say it in a friendly way. You are the executive editor of the world's greatest tabloid.
And champion of tabloid values.
Right.
Which I define in a somewhat different way from traditional definitions. Tabloid journalism is journalism driven by focus, concentration on individuals as distinct from the workings of institutions. So even if we cover institutions such as government or the Federal Reserve, we tend to do so from the point of, with the perspective that they're run by individual men and women. But my sense of public journalism is this, that in New York City, a very different and unique market, we practice a different form of public journalism altogether, which consists in having 3 daily newspapers, at least 5 television stations, broadcast, plus cable channels, and maybe a half dozen odd weekly magazines, monthly magazines. And all of us, so to speak, wake up every morning and scream our brains out about everything, each from a different perspective and a different ideological, each pursuing more or less blatantly a different ideological agenda. Out of that cacophony of voices emerges something resembling truth or reality.
What is all this whole thing that's going on? I mean, you have all these bright young journalism majors in school and bright young journalists talking about this wonderful new thing and raising high this standard.
Well, I think there's another element to it, and it relates to what Jim said, which is that I think there are many of us who do feel that we have a responsibility to create a safe space for a deliberative dialogue, that it is part of our roles to do that. I'll give you one example.
A safe space for a deliberative dialogue.
Mm-hmm. It's not talk radio, it's not people yelling at each other, but it's not also what traditional op-ed pages have been like. For example, our newspaper will do what it's always done, which is endorse candidates in this election cycle. And we will interview the candidates and research them and talk to folks about them and dissect their records. But in some cases, we're also going out and meeting with voters from those districts.
Why isn't what the New York Post does community journalism, public journalism?
It very well might be. I'm really not very hung up on these labels. I don't find them very satisfactory at all. I just think it's good journalism with a slightly broader framework than what we've had in the past.
But I think there's a big difference between what Jane does on her editorial page, where I think we'd all agree that's the place where opinion should be, and the main thrust of the new quote-unquote public journalism, which interestingly enough, the American Journalism Review says is not so popular among young reporters, but among older publishers looking for ways to make money. But it is quite a different thing for front pages to go out and have polls done, or to go out, as in one case, and tell all the reporters to talk to 4 people, which seemed to be a rather small sample, and come back and decide, as is the case in North Carolina right now, what the total range of issues that are going to be covered, not just in one paper, but in several papers and several television stations, with the result that the actual candidates running down there, candidates like Harvey Gantt, are having no coverage at all, are unable to get their message out. It is a real taking away of the political process from politicians who, whatever their faults, their fault is not usually that they're not poll-driven enough, but that they're too poll-driven.
Most advocates of public journalism I know don't say that you have to cover the campaign, but you cover it in a different way and from a different angle, and you bring in the issues that touch people's lives as well as the horse race, which dominates everything. I mean, we have a democracy that's not really functioning all that well. I speak as a political scientist. If you look at the turnout, if you look at the knowledge that citizens have about the campaign, I mean, 40% don't know that Jack Kemp is Bob Dole's running mate, and a quarter don't know the vice president is Clinton's running mate. This was a Washington Post Kaiser study recently. So we've got a public that is just barely attentive, that reacts to a vague impression of sound bites and headlines. And if your notion of public journalism is everybody shouting at each other, it's hard for people to think when everybody's shouting. And the question is, how are you going
to tell them to think with a public opinion poll?
Well, I'm not an advocate. I'm a critic of conventional public opinion polls. I have a new method which I call deliberative polling. Do you want me to say a word about that?
About one or several. Yeah, right.
The idea of deliberative polling is to go beyond conventional public opinion polling, because if you just do conventional polling to advise newspapers or whatever, you may well just reflect back the public's vague impression of what's already being covered. But there's another question. What would the people think if they actually had an opportunity to overcome what social scientists have called rational ignorance? I mean, there's a reason the public's turned off. If I've got one vote in millions, why should I pay a lot of attention to the complexities of public policy? Because I won't have much effect. But if we can create a social context where people actually can get engaged in the issues, where they think their voice matters, they pay attention, they do the hard work of listening to competing
and you brought
views.
Together 500 people as a fine sample and put them to school basically for a few days.
Well, we put the whole country in one room under conditions where they could think through the issues and ask their questions of competing experts and competing politicians, including the vice president, over several days of discussion. And in preparation for that, they started listening to the media, reading up on the issues, talking to friends and family, hearing competing points of view, and we had dramatic changes of opinion about their view of the priorities.
Forgive my saying so, but the elitism inherent in that statement takes my breath away. Its underlying assumption seems to be that the public is incapable of making up its own mind or listening with applying any critical thinking to issues in an environment in which there are many voices being heard. It strikes me that in most of the markets where I'm not a great believer in polls or in focus groups, I'm a believer in the market. And in most of the places in America where public journalism has taken hold, I noticed that by and large they tend overwhelmingly to be in cities that are monopoly newspaper markets, small cities or medium-sized cities with only a single newspaper, which tends to be march in lockstep with the advertising community. In larger cities, including Philadelphia and Boston, it invariably tends to be the paper, in the case of the Inquirer or the Globe in Boston, the paper that is utterly dominant in that market. And it seems to me that in a city with a diversity of media voices, as in New York, or in the country as a whole, which has a diversity of media voices, it's unthinkable that public journalism, as I understand you folks, drawing, in effect, drawing yourself in with the voters or to influence the political agenda could really take place. Who determines what the issues are that matter to voters other than the voters themselves? Do they need to be guided and told from on high?
The idea is, the assumption is not that people are incapable, rather they're not effectively motivated. In fact, we've discovered that they are very capable of assessing the issues if you just give them a context where they can talk to other people and where they have some reason to pay attention and become engaged.
I take great issue about this being elitist. First of all, I'm just doing what I'm doing on my pages, and that is basically good reporting. And it's the kind of reporting that an editorial page editor hasn't done in the past on the Philadelphia Inquirer. I spent a whole lot less time at cocktail parties with the elite in the Philadelphia region and more time just being in gatherings and listening to ordinary
and
folks.
And it's fewer syndicated columns.
But this is
No,
an
that's
odd
not
thing.
true.
Not true.
The editorial pages are turning to reporting because the reporting pages are turning to editorializing. Right. But I think I much prefer Steve's model where we let all the flowers bloom, but the fact is that we're getting fewer and fewer newspapers. Seems to me then that we ought to demand more objectivity of a newspaper, less cheerleading, less leading of crusades when it's only one than when they're five. And so I think the whole trend runs in the wrong way.
There was a poll run recently that asked about the ideological leanings of the Washington Press Corps and their editors. It was overwhelmingly, beyond anybody's prior belief, that they were far more liberal than the public as a whole. If the public journalism advocates are saying, boy, we ought to get more of us in the story and explain to people what's wrong, isn't that automatically going to come out even more as a trick of liberals to do more of what they're
the idea is to get the people into the story, not the pundits. Not the pundits, and it's to facilitate the people coming to their own conclusions and getting the people's agenda aired in the newspaper so that people can connect with the stories.
So you're going to have 10 young journalists, 9 of whom are liberals, going out and finding that the people really have a conservative agenda.
Is that what we're saying? That's why I've devised this elaborate process of random sampling the people and of everything being transparent in terms of everything that is given to the people.
But I'm talking about this general
more general
concept,
phenomenon,
which we still have not appropriately defined, by the way.
Because it can't be defined. I mean, every newspaper is doing things in their own way. And I think that's one of the problems with public journalism, and I've written about this. I think the folks who are sort of leading this movement haven't been discerning enough. I don't think that they've said that there are some things newspapers ought not to do. And I don't think that it's our role to shape the agenda except on the editorial pages. I do think it's our role to listen, especially to the folks that we don't ordinarily listen to.
But it seems to me that if editors and publishers want to invest themselves in the civic process of interaction between elected officials and the voters on the other, let them run for mayor, let them run for councilman, and let them take those steps that mean true investment in the system.
I think newspapers and the press in general, media, should be concerned with getting people discussing the issues in an informed way. We had a big debate among presidential candidates. The real future of democracy rests not with the debate among candidates, but with the debate among the people. Can we facilitate a debate among the people? Then those who want to vote can decide to vote. But at least if they vote, they'll be informed. But it's a difficult process to figure out how can we actually get them engaged enough so that they'll even pay attention.
Jodie, what is seeking to be born here?
It seems to me that the big case behind it is a desire to sell more newspapers. Now that is not a new concern on the part of newspaper
not to become
publishers.
part of the process and purvey their particular ideological sort of goody two-shoes establishment sort of a thing. My words.
Well, some of that too, but I think as you look especially at a chain like Knight Ridder, which has been a leader in the public journalism idea, they are concerned, as are all publishers, about the fact that newspaper sales have not been growing, and in some cities have been declining, and they're looking at all these the competition they're getting from television and from the internet and so on, and they want to boost sales, and they say, well, the way to boost sales is to make the paper more relevant to people's concerns. But that, it's a natural impulse, but it's a dangerous one. Once you depart from the notion of our job, like it or not, is to present the news and the facts as fairly as we can, realizing we don't always do it right. We can present them in a more interesting way, and I think this has been a good move. But to then slavishly turn it into, we'll go out and do a poll and let people tell us what we already knew. And remember, everybody knows that pollsters decide A, what questions to ask, and B, how to ask them, and that the answers they get, not in Jim's kind of poll, but that's not what we're talking
moreover,
about.
when politicians follow polls, we say, oh my God,
Oh, isn't
following
it terrible?
a terrible thing.
So now
and
here's
then
the
when
newspaper.
Newspapers follow polls, people say, isn't that wonderful?
Yes,
Well,
why would that be?
I think I mean, I'm not going to defend that. We don't do that, and I never would, but I do think you have to be careful here, because you're talking about a whole lot of newspapers doing a whole lot of different things, and I think it's not fair to brandish them all with one kind of brush. I mean, I agree with you, Jodie. We have never done pollings here. I agree with you, Steve. We haven't done voter registration drives. Another newspaper in Philadelphia did. I would find that to be to compromise our independence, because in fact, the news side of the Philadelphia Inquirer did a terrific job a few years ago of uncovering a vote fraud scandal that was perpetuated by the very people who were trying to get people to sign up for votes. And I couldn't do that. I mean, I just feel like that would be really out of bounds.
I feel that what you're doing in the Inquirer isn't public journalism as you've defined it, Jim, notwithstanding that there is a certain fuzziness about the definitions. I'd make one more point. Jodie, you mentioned that publishers are promoting or tolerating public journalism in their pages with the hope of selling more papers. And my guess is that they're really doing it to sell more advertising. I don't believe that anybody has any great hope of turning on a younger generation that doesn't have the newspaper habit to going out and buying newspapers in great numbers. I think that nothing becomes a monopoly newspaper more in its market, or the dominant newspaper in its market when there is one clearly dominant, than an aura of objectivity and civic responsibility. And frankly, the kind of public journalism that promotes a sort of overall fuzzily defined good government agenda, let's get people out and vote, let's look at the issues that really matter to their lives, is bland enough to promote that aura of objectivity.
It's sort of a fake populism.
And sell more department store advertising.
You are saying it's a fake populism, whereas the tabloid voice is the real populism.
I'm not saying that the tabloid voice in itself is the real populist voice. I say that the multiplicity of voices is the real populist voice.
Can I introduce an historical note for a second? The public opinion poll was itself launched by newspapers. And newspapers were attacked for intervening in the political process when they did so. And in fact, most dramatically, even George Gallup's initial launch of the poll in the 1936 election was financed in large part by the Washington Post. So now, when newspapers conduct polls, they have an effect on the election. All these horse race polls have an effect. Bandwagon effects, momentum effects, certainly in the primary season and in the general election. Now, somehow that's now become part of the modus operandi of newspapers, and it's not thought that they're intervening, but they are intervening. My particular notion is, why not intervene with polls that measure in a more thoughtful way what the public would think? But these other efforts to consult the public are just efforts that they are much less dramatic interventions in the political process than what newspapers are doing all the time.
I also think we've set up a false dichotomy here, acting as if there's objective journalism in some pure form that used to be practiced until very recently, and this new sort of brand of public journalism, when in fact we always make judgments and choices in our journalism. We try to do it, we are professionals, and so we try to do it as fairly as possible. But we are choosing to describe a political campaign as a battlefield, or we can choose to describe it as a discussion. And we use those words every single day.
Is this tendency toward public journalism, whatever it means, impacting on this election this year?
I don't think it's had a very big effect on the presidential election. For one reason is that people are just not very concerned about anything. What the polls show is that although crime pops up as the highest concern, that's got it because it gets a 10% vote, and which is why this year paying attention to polls is especially misleading. But it is making a difference, and some state and local elections, North Carolina being one very clear example, and I don't think it's making, that it's having a good effect. I think it's having a worrisome effect.
That the paper there is setting the agenda and forcing the candidates to talk about that, or they won't cover them in the paper.
They're not even covering the candidates. They're sort of covering themselves. It's just sort of statewide thumb-sucking. I really, with the TV going along with it, I think it's a bad thing. It's not democracy as I know it. And I think there is a pickup on something Jane said. I think she's right that newspapers are if you look at the long term, they've certainly gotten better informed and, in fact, more objective. But that has been their goal. When you now switch the goal and say, no, forget the objectivity, the point is to get in tune with what the people want, you'll see the trend gradually move in the other direction.
But
I don't think it's healthy.
Is it just what the people want or what the reporters want?
Well, see, there's the dangerous thing. We decide, what question to ask the people. I think, once you get that mindset, the danger's always there anyway, and when you feed it, it gets worse.
Right, and if you're a suspicious non-liberal like your moderator, and you look at these polls of saying, well, most of those reporters are swinging from the liberal side of the plate, is that not grounds for being suspicious of this?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Thank you all. Thank you, Jane Eisner, Jodie Allen, James Fishkin, and Steve Cuozzo. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our viewers. You can send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.